Well, thank you all for showing up for this. I really appreciate the invite. I usually jump at the opportunity to talk to a captive audience about bats. In fact, if we could lock the doors. I have a couple of goals for today, one of which is just to kind of introduce you to bats. People generally have sort of misguided attitudes about bats. And if you think it's hard to convince people to save what we might call charismatic megafauna like elephants, rhinos, whales, giant pandas, try doing it with an animal that's usually not thought of as much better than something like a mosquito, that they are not worthy of our attention, and they're really just sort of bird that need to be extinguished. The second goal was to talk about how bats, because of their unique natural history, provide for us an insight into what is happening in ecosystems. Bats are very sensitive, and I mean that both emotionally, but also in terms of how they react to degraded environmental conditions. Because they sort of live on the edge of mammals. They are one of the most highly evolved of all the mammals. They have extremely unique physiology. And because of that, they're sensitive to changes such as climate change, changes in precipitation. So Mark and also Andreas did a great kind of segue into what I'm going to talk about in the latter half of the talk, and that is bats and water resource availability, and how bats show, as canaries in a global coal mine, what is going to cascade through ecosystems, as they tend to be the most sensitive, at least in terms of the terrestrial species, to water availability. Where do bats come from? Well, they've been around a long time, and bats come off of ancestral mammals that were around for, coexisted for about 100 million years with the dinosaurs, and then in that great cataclysmic event, which happened over actually about 1 million years, the dinosaurs went extinct in the Cretaceous extinctions, which was punctuated by apparently an asteroid strike. What shows up almost immediately after that event, which took out approximately 76% of all life on Earth, came bats. And in fact, the fossil record of bats dates them back to coming off this early clade known as insectivores. Today we know them as shrews and moles. But the ancestor of bats isn't clear, but we do know they came off almost immediately, and it's possible that because of the earliest fossil record of bats is in North America, that they evolved in the New World. Possibly Wyoming, believe it or not. And it might be hard to imagine this, but Wyoming was tropical rainforest 65 million years ago. And bats remain today mostly tropical, but some species have gotten into temperate areas. So the oldest full-bodied bat fossils known from the Green River Formation is estimated to be 52 million years old, and we know this is Icarinicterus index, so named after Icarus, who flew up to the sun with wax wings that melted and fell back to Earth. This particular fossil has been instrumental and really is one of the main ones for the earliest record of bats, but teeth of bats, which are very difficult to tell from shrews, but seem to date back to possibly 8 million years. So bats may have been flying around in the last days of the large dinosaurs such as Tyrannosaurus rex. We know that these bats were full bats. These are not transitional forms. They were flying around eating insects using echolocation as they do today. And so the transitional stages from a non-flying mammal to bats is something we don't know much about. They're extremely unique. There's 1,200 species on Earth today out of 5,200 living mammal species. So they make up about 23% of all living mammals. They are the second most diverse group. The first one, does anybody know what the first diverse group of mammals is? Rodents. Rodents make up about 45% of all living mammals today. So I like to tell people that if you're a mammal on Earth today, there's about a 65 to 70% chance that you're either a bat or a rat. Primates make up less than 1% of Earth's biodiversity, and biodiversity is, the amount of biodiversity is not necessarily a measure of their contribution to ecosystem function, but bats are widely diverse and distributed on all continents except Antarctica, and they contribute intensely to the function of ecosystems, and they are critical to human health, and I hope to impress that upon you today. Bats are unique in many ways. As I said, their physiology, their heart rate is 1,200 beats a minute. When they're flying, it's 20 beats a second. It's hard to imagine. But because of that, they have to eat tremendous amounts of food, and this is one of the main ecological services that they provide to humans is their consumption of insects, consumption of dispersible fruits and seeds. A single little brown bat that weighs 6 grams will eat thousands of mosquitoes a night. And when you build that up to colony sizes of bats, they're pulling metric tons of insects out of the air nightly. They use sonar, which is beyond our imagination in terms of its technicalities. We can't even come close to replicating it. The sonar calls are very loud. If we could hear bats doing it, it's above our hearing range. But if we could hear them, it would be like putting your ear 4 inches away from a smoke detector, turning it on. So the sonar calls are high intensity calls, which take a tremendous amount of energy. They can fly and capture insects in complete darkness using this echolocation. As you see from these bat portraits, bats have good vision. They have great eyes. But eyes are not something that function well when there's no light. Not many of us would run through the woods at night in complete darkness. So echolocation provides them an opportunity to hunt evasive insects in complete darkness. There are 2 suborders of bats. Bats are in the order Chiroptera. Chiro means hand in Latin. Ptera means wing, so hand wing. There are 2 suborders. There's the big hand wing bats, and these are the Megachiropterans that only occur in the Old World. So if in Africa, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and Australia, you may have seen these bats. Some of them get up to 6-foot wingspans. They're critical to tropical ecosystem health for dispersal fruits and seeds. The Microchiropterans, the other suborder, has a huge diversity of bats, whereas megabats are only about 200 species. The microbats, 900 species or more, and they are incredibly diverse ecologically in what they do. And not all bats are simply brown. This is called the painted bat, one of the most beautiful animals on the planet, even being biased. Echolocation is astonishing. It's the ability to produce sound and then listen to that sound and interpret your environment based on that. Bats see the environment and sound like we see it with our eyes. And because of that, they can navigate in complete darkness. And so I titled this talk, Carpe Noctem, it sees the night. Bats that sees the night in ways that no other organisms have. Their calls are different than what we see in the cetaceans, the whales and other types of cetaceans, such as the dolphins. They use click systems, very simple click systems. Bat calls are tonal. They sweep from what we call an FM frequency sweep, sometimes 10 times above our hearing range, down to right above it. But this frequency sweep allows for incredible information gathering in the sonar call. This is, well, let me move on here to this next one first. Because it's so energy expensive to echolocate, it's literally screaming at the top of their lungs all night. And if you've ever tried that, you know how tiring it is. If you have kids, you probably really know how tiring it is. But bats phase this in different ways to save on energy. They have a search phase where they pulse their voice about 25 times a second, an approach phase where they increase that pulse rate to 50 times a second, and then in the terminal phase, what we call a feeding buzz, They pulse their voice 250 times in 1 second to get a very detailed, this is what it sounds like. Search phase, approach phase, terminal feeding buzz phase. And so they do this to save energy while they're foraging for food. And they only go into the terminal phase within a meter of striking an insect. Bats also have co-evolved with ecosystems. They drive co-evolution of many systems. One of the most intriguing ones is how bats have affected insects, particularly night-flying insects. There's a lot to talk about here, but I'll make it quick. A lot of the moths, particularly their Arctic moths, have evolved ears on their thorax, which are sensitive to the echolocation of bats. So they can hear the bats coming. And when they hear the bats coming, when the bats go into that terminal phase, the moths will go into an evasive maneuver, a lot of times folding their wings and dropping straight down to the ground. Bats still catch them about 9 out of 10 times anyway, but even that savings in terms of the rate of insect reproduction is huge for them. Some species have taken it even further and developed or evolved a series of scales on the side of their body along with this ear that allows them to generate ultrasound when bats get close. And so they can hear the bats coming, and then as the bat is about to strike, they'll scrape these scales and send out a jamming echolocation signal to confuse the bats. And the frequency and the modulation of these ultrasonic pulses coming from an insect exactly map over the frequency calls of these bats. It's really quite an amazing system. So if you're a beautiful moth flying around on a summer evening and enjoying the beauty of a nighttime summer, this may be the last thing that you see. The social lives of bats is broad and deep, and a lot of this work now is coming out of the Max Planck Institute by biologists there, and really it goes beyond what our expectations of what bats are, only because of our typical bias around other animals and their emotional lives. But we've known for a long time that female bats are intense mothers, and they have to be, because bats are not like rodents. They are actually long-lived. There are some records of bats in the United States at 40 years old. There's a recent one captured in Germany that was 52 years old. So bats are long-lived, and they only have one young a year in most cases. There's some that have twins. But they have one young a year, and so parental care is quite excessive on each young. Here is a megabat with its offspring. This is Mexican free-tailed bats, and this is a babysitter that was left back in the roost to watch a creche of young bats while the other mothers are out foraging, and they'll trade off to watch over them. Baby bats are born up to about 40% of their mother's body size at birth. So that would be like a 100-pound woman giving birth to a 40-pound baby. I don't want to hear any more whining about the pain of childbirth in humans. Okay. They don't really wrap them in blankets like this. These are rescued, at least their mothers. These are rescued bats in Australia, but they're quite cute and very, very bright animals. One of the first things that came out in the insight of how intimate bats are was this tale of the midwife bat, which was published by Thomas Kuntz, actually, in National Geographic, and he observed this at the Luby Foundation in Florida, which is a rescue site for flying foxes. What they witnessed was that this female was the first birth she had ever done, and so she did not know what she was doing, and she was hanging from her feet, and which is not the way to give birth, even if you're a bat, because you want to use gravity. And so this other female came over and started helping her and giving her instructions. So she started hanging from her thumbs, which is the correct birthing position for a bat. The other female followed her and did it, and that helped because gravity helps move the kid through the birth canal. But you can see this is a breech birth, okay, which is highly problematic. The midwife stayed with this female and licked and helped pull and essentially gave birth to this young bat successfully. So they were best friends, and bats do form friends, and they form extremely long-term relationships. Work that's been done again out of the Max Planck put pit tags in bats in wild colonies and put pit tag readers. So pit tags are sort of like the little microchips you put in your pets, right? Or barcode identification tags. And what they did was they monitored movements of these colonies miles away from each other, and how bats were moving potentially between these colonies. And as it turns out, bats that were born in the same colony don't necessarily stay in that same colony, and they move around. But what they found is that some bats appeared to be very good friends of one another, so they would move from one colony to another and visit this other colony and stay for a few days, and then go back to their colony, and a few weeks later, the bat that they visited from that colony would go to their colony. They have sleepovers, essentially. And this went on for years and years. And so because bats are long-lived, it's not surprising that they have these long-term relationships. Bat societies are very complex. Bats have all types of communication that's going on there. Some of it is audible, some of it is ultrasound, but they use bat-friendly whistles. They commonly hug one another. Mark talked about play and dogs. Bats play like crazy. I used to have young bats in the lab when I was a graduate student, and they chased each other around when they were left free to fly around the lab. They'd chase each other. One would land on the ceiling, the other one would land next to it, whack it with its forearm, knock it off, and they just chase each other all over the place. And they tend to hug each other a lot and kiss each other as well. Baby bats babble, which is, well, you probably know what babbling is. It's using the language, but using it in a nonsensical way. And so this is something that is only thought that human babies did, but as it turns out, bats do this as well. And so bats have these same developmental social patterns that we see in organisms and even in humans, and not only humans, but other organisms that we tend to associate sort of almost at a human level, right? Like elephants, the cetaceans, and other primates. So who would ever thought bats would do this sort of thing? Turns out they also have a sense of humor, and they like to show off a lot. Voice recognition is something that bats do very well. They know their friends, they know their voices just like we do. They also use apparently greetings when their friends come around, or they see them when they're flying around or hear them. They will let out specific calls that bring these bats together in space and time. And one of the earliest studies that was done was when females take their young out to teach them how to forage for insects, they have a meetup tree in case they get separated at night. It's kind of like your kid in the grocery store that, you get lost, go up front to the front door and I'll meet you there. It's these meetup trees in the environment that females and their young go to if they get separated. Bats can also distinguish other species of bats because they are speaking a slightly different language. So they can differentiate between different species, and they can actually understand those different species. In terms of why bats are intimate to human health is because they provide ecological services really on a level that very few other organisms do. One of the main ones, particularly here in North America, is insectivory, the ability to eat insects. And as I said, bats have very high metabolic rates. They eat their entire body weight in insects at night. So, we like me sitting down to dinner and eating 100-pound, 160-pound, or 100-pound salad, right? It's probably not going to happen. How can you eat that much food? But bats can do it. Because of that, and their high metabolic rate that they need to fuel with this fuel means that they're pulling metric tons of insects out of the environment every night. What would be a relatively modest colony of big brown bats that we have here in Colorado, so 150 big brown bats, annually consumes these numbers of insects. 600,000 cucumber beetles, 194,000 June beetles, 160,000 leafhoppers, 335,000 stink bugs. Okay, these are crop pests in many cases, but it goes much further than that, because if you calculate in that each cucumber beetle, for example, can lay around 110 eggs on average, this small colony of bats saves the production of 33 million cucumber offspring. The effect is not just on what exactly it is they're eating. Bats also move insects around. So, in fact, there's been studies done in Europe where they just played bat sonar into agricultural fields, and all the agricultural pests take off. So bats move insects around as well. They don't allow them to stay in one place and consume everything until it's gone and then move on. Work that's been done in the tropics has shown that bats are extremely important to decreasing arthropod densities in those forests, so that again, the insects don't stay there and eat everything that's available in one spot. It's been estimated that bats save the U.S. agricultural industry between $7 and $57 billion a year in agricultural use. If we look at it more globally, pollination and seed dispersal, there's really not much like bats. Even birds don't quite match up because bats eat so much food. They move a lot of things around. But at least 550 species of plants in the neotropics are seed dispersed or pollinated by bats. 3 families in particular, Agaveaceae, agaves. If you like tequila, thank bats. Okay. If you like to use agave syrup as a sweetener, thank bats. If you love the desert Southwest and the iconic Saguaro, Cordon, and Oregon pipe cactus, thank bats. Without bats, they wouldn't be. And they're keystone species. If they collapse, the desert ecosystem collapses with them. There are also figs. Figs are big in the tropics, and figs fuel tropical ecosystems. Without bats, you don't get seed dispersal figs. And it's been shown in areas that have been clear-cut. The first plants to come back are those that are dispersed by bats. So bats can fly these seeds around, in some cases, hundreds of miles, hundreds of kilometers. Other things like population control, cultural services, and ecotourism. Has anybody here been to the Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, Texas? Go. You gotta go there. Yeah, it's a life-changing experience. This is a picture right here. When Bat Conservation International moved from Milwaukee to Austin, Texas, the town of Austin, Texas was talking about exterminating 4 million Mexican free-tailed bats from under this Congress Avenue Bridge. Health hazards, public health hazard. Okay. Amazingly, Merlin Tuttle talked them into keeping these bats there and worked with them to build an ecotourism situation. Thousands of people come to watch these bats leave this bridge every year. They bring multi-million dollars of tourist money into Austin. Everybody in Austin loves these bats. Public health concern. Every night there are thousands of people and 4 million bats coming out from under this bridge for the last 20 years. Never an incident, never a problem. So humans can live with bats. They are not a public health threat. Medicine and medical treatments. Bats are involved in the medicine field. In fact, vampire bat saliva is now being used as an anticoagulant. They drive nocturnal food webs, and guano, which bats produce a lot of because they eat so much, is a huge part of the GDP of a lot of countries, including Mexico and Ghana and many of the African countries. It's literally mined out of these caves and sold as a fertilizer. In fact, McGuckin's in Boulder, you can buy bat guano fertilizer. If you want your plants to explode, it's a guano fertilizer. There's nothing better. Threats to bats. What's called chiroptophobia, however, that to me says fear of hands. It should be chiropterophobia. Does anybody know this reference here? Hunter S. Thompson. Anyway, and vampires and all of the mythology that goes around bats, of course, is very, very profound and has a profound effect on how people think about bats. As it turns out, the real biology of bats is much more amazing, but it's not fearful. And people, we like to be scared. We really do. And bats provide that. But the way they're depicted, of course, is not the way they are at all. Another major threat to bats, and Andreas touched on this, bats, major public health threat. Okay. I just showed you that they weren't. And I have experienced in other countries such as South Africa and Mozambique and Swaziland. If you go into tourist areas, there are always bats there. In fact, in Kruger National Park, you sit and eat dinner under a thatched roof hut that has 200 fruit bats in it. That would never be allowed in the US, most likely. Never a problem, never a threat, never a disease transfer. But bats are blamed constantly for being vectors and reservoirs of human zoonotic diseases, and there is almost zero proof that bats have ever transmitted anything besides rabies to a human. Here's a case in point with MERS, which I'm sure you've heard about, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. These are the types of headlines that come out, and these are some of the more mild ones around bats. The media loves to hate bats because it sells. And so one of the biggest conservation threats to bats now, today, is that bats are a public health risk. There's a lot of money involved with this as well. NIH is funneling millions of dollars into virus work on bats. And much of this work is simply screening bats for viruses and saying bats have them and they're a public health threat. Give me more money, please. Much of this research is based purely on bats having antibodies to these diseases. I've been in some of these areas. I probably have antibodies to some of these diseases. Antibodies just mean you were exposed. With the MERS, bats were blamed for quite a few years on this. This came out this year. Oh, sorry. Now, and not that you can't have more than one reservoir for a disease, but again, the hard work of actually understanding whether there's the possibility of transfer directly from bats to humans is not being done. They're simply being screened. And this goes back to the mining of guano. In fact, some have suggested that humans might be bringing these diseases into the cave ecosystem with sick individuals that have picked it up somewhere else, perhaps eating other species of bushmeat, and actually infecting bats. Virus folks don't even consider that a possibility. So it's one of the biggest threats that we're working on now, and we haven't really made much headway because nobody will listen at all. It's the same thing that went on with rabies. 4 people die of rabies a year in North America. It's very rare. It's easily preventable. But bats get associated with that, and whenever there's a rabies article in the newspaper, people freak out. They go out and start killing bats. It's as simple as that. Other threats to bats are unfortunate, and because we actually want this technology, right? We want to capture the wind and capture the energy produced by the wind. However, as it turns out, whatever we do has a footprint, and it's a huge threat, particularly to migrating bats such as hoary bats, which we have here in Colorado. Wind turbines kill millions and millions of bats a year. They used to kill birds a lot, but they've changed the design of them. Unfortunately, this change of design now is focused on killing bats. Amazingly enough, the props on these turbines are not what's killing the bats directly. At first, it was thought that bats were being struck by them. As it turns out, these turbines create a low pressure system behind them, a pocket of low pressure. And that pocket of low pressure has been measured and is known to be 4 times larger than required to pop the lungs of a rat. And so what happens is bats fly into this intense low pressure pocket, and literally their lungs explode in their chest. And this was found out because a graduate student at Calgary, the University of Calgary, was collecting bats at wind turbine sites. She collected 2,000 bats killed at a wind turbine site, and almost none of them showed any physical damage whatsoever. And she started dissecting them and finding hemorrhaged lungs in all of their chest cavities. So this is a huge problem. That, as it turns out, it looks like the fix for it is relatively simple theoretically, but hard in practice. It turns out the greatest high pressure, low pressure systems behind these turbines happen when the turbines are spinning incredibly slowly. In fact, so slow that they're not generating electricity. And so what bat biologists are trying to get the industry to do is to feather these turbines below a certain speed limit that is locked so that they're not turning. And this could very easily solve the problem. However, the problem is they're not set up to do this, right? In practice, what do you have to do? Well, a technician has to climb each of these towers and lock the turbine. It's not like you can press a button on a computer or master control to shut them all off. They're not going to take on that sort of responsibility, right? Of sending technicians out to climb thousands of towers to shut them off. So they're trying to now develop turbines that can be shut off in this way, but so far they're not out there. Another big threat to bats is a fungus that was brought over from Europe in 2000. Well, we don't know when it was brought over, but it showed up in a colony of bats in New York in 2006. And it's known as, these days, Pseudogymnoascus destructans. The fungus itself is not really visible or anything in caves. The spores are there, which are microscopic, you can't see. But it enters into these cave systems that are cool and actually are perfect hibernation sites for bats. It gets on the skin of the bats. You can see it here. It's called white nose syndrome. Okay, so these bats have not been out partying. They actually have fungus on their nose. And it also gets on their wing membranes, and this fungus is so invasive with its root system that it goes all the way down into the dermis, destroys all of the tissue of the epidermis while it's doing that. And it does 2 things. One, it keeps waking bats up during hibernation, and bats have to live off stored energy, stored food in their fat reserves over winter. And every time you wake a bat up out of hibernation, it burns 30 days of fat just to wake it up. So these bats are being repeatedly woken up, and they go into what's called thermogenesis. They burn all this fat to wake up. And so what ends up happening is something like this. This was taken in Wisconsin. This is February, and this is outside a hibernation site out in the environment. All these bats flew out of the cave because they are starving to death and they're looking for food. There's no food in February. So they all end up dead. At least 6 million bats have been killed in the last 8 years, probably 2 or 3 times that in reality. Some colonies have gone from 35,000 individuals to 0 in less than a year. It's devastating in the east. This is where it is now since 2006. It has moved as far west as Missouri, and also north into Canada, up into Nova Scotia. And so it tends to be moving north and southwest. It was thought to be here, but that was reinvestigated and turned out not to be true, which meant we thought it was on the doorstep of Colorado, but it's not. We hope it's hit an environmental barrier here because there are only about 7 species of bats in the eastern US. Once you get into the west, there are 35 species of bats. And so the effect is going to be much larger. What I want to talk about now is climate change in bats, and I'm determined to get us out here for lunch because I'm getting hungry. So I'm going to do this pretty quickly. But what we've been interested is in the effect of water availability on bats. And we all know about climate change. It's an intercontinental effect for the most part. And what we see is, as Andreas pointed out, the desert Southwest up into Colorado. Montana is supposed to be the hardest hit. There's also an elevational component to this that if we look at the Colorado River Basin, whereas the western U.S. has increased 1.7 degrees, Colorado has an average of 1.9, the Colorado River Basin, which means up in the areas where you're getting snowpack, and which is the reserves for our fresh water, is heating at a faster rate. This is going, and if we overlay biodiversity of bats in the U.S. over this, we see where that biodiversity is right in the desert Southwest. The hydrology is going to change dramatically, and it is amazing how much hydrology is affected by simple changes in global climate. This study by Christensen showed that 1 degree Celsius change, increase in heat, 24% less snowpack, 3% less precipitation, 36% less water storage, 1 degree. We're past that point already in Colorado. How is this going to affect wildlife? Humans require functioning ecosystems to survive. It provides everything we need: clean air, oxygen, water, all of that. Bats are excellent bioindicators because female bats in particular roost in very hot roost sites where they give birth to their young. And the reason they do that is because bats spend so much energy when they're awake and foraging, they go into torpor. And so they slow their heart rate down 1 beat a minute, they breathe once a minute, and they pick these roost sites that mimic their body temperature. So they can go to sleep and give up their body temperature and become the ambient temperature, and it's still warm enough to help gestate the young in the body. So it's an incredible strategy for saving energy. The downside of it is that in a dry climate, they're in this intensely hot environment and they are evaporating water. And over one 12-hour period, bats have, some species of bats have lost as much as 30% of their body mass just through evaporation. It's astonishing. Again, a 100-pound person waking up in the morning weighing 70 pounds. Sounds like a good diet plan, right? But actually you wouldn't wake up, you'd be dead, because we can handle about 7 or 8% of our body mass loss through water. Not only that, but these females have a little ectoparasite called a young bat on its side, on their side, sucking milk out, and milk is composed of 75% water. And so this has a huge effect on female bats. But how much of an effect does it really have? I kind of imagine it as female bats must be coming out of their roost site, and their bodies must just look like a raisin, a wrinkled up raisin. And we got a shot of a female coming out of the roost site, and sure enough, they are raisins. That's not real. Okay. What we found in the foothills, and most of our work's done in Boulder County, what we find is that through radio telemetry, putting radio transmitters on bats and then tracking them, we can find their roost sites. These marks, the W's are water holes. These are water holes that are there all year, but they're very, very small water holes. Sometimes less than 3 meters in diameter. Bats congregate their roost sites around them. And the reason they congregate their roost sites around them is so when they come out of their roost sites at night, they're raisins, and they need to drink water immediately. At least hypothetically, that was the situation. So we asked the interesting question of, do juvenile bats drive their mothers to drink? We know human children do drive their mothers to drink, but we weren't sure about bats. So we ran a little experiment on a fringe myotis, which likes particularly hot roost sites in an area north of Boulder. And what we did is we set up 2 netting sites where we caught the bats. And in between those 2 netting sites, we put in an artificial water hole. And therefore, when we caught the bats at these 2 sites, which tends to kind of freak them out and they don't come back there for a while, we thought it would drive them to the artificial water hole. When we caught the bats, we put a little pit tag in them, so a little ID tag under the skin. Okay, and what this allowed us to do is, I had this grand idea, I didn't know if it would work, but I went and got a submersible pit tag antenna reader that was used to track pit tag fish. And the idea was that if I could put this just below the surface of the water, okay, it should be in an artificial water hole, it should be able to pick up the pit tag in the back of the bat and tell me who's there, how many times they came, how many nights they drank there, how many years they were there. This was hooked up to a reader with a battery and a solar panel to keep it working. And we pit tagged lactating female bats and non-lactating, non-reproductive female bats from the same colony. And you can see bats are coming in here and they're skimming, they're drinking water, and they're going right across this plate antenna, and that plate antenna is reading their ID tag. This is what we found. Over 11 days, okay, in this left-hand column, this is the number of visits of lactating female bats to that water hole, and it sums to 255 visits over that 11-night period. The non-reproductive females did not drink nearly as much. Also, what we found was that bats, when they come out of their roost site right after dusk, they drink like crazy, as you would expect. Then throughout the night, they don't drink that much, and then right before going back into their roost site in the morning, they come in and drink a bunch again. Makes sense, right? But this is the first time on a wild bat population that had data like this. Fundamentally, lactating females visited 13 times more to drink than non-reproductive females. We were able to use these numbers, and I won't go into details about how we calculated this, but we could draw up a hypothetical relationship between water availability, lactation, and survivorship of adult females and the ability of those females to give birth to young. So starting out with a hypothetical colony of around 1,800 individuals, 1,790 if you want to be exact, versus Christensen's 1 degree change, 36% less water availability. And what we did was design this decay model which showed that with 1 degree change, okay, which we're past now, we've already dropped this colony down to less than 1,200 individuals that could produce offspring and lactate for their young. 2 degrees, you've cut it by more than half, okay? And as we get into the 3 degree area, 4 degree area, you start getting past the point where you can have viable bat populations. We also looked at 13 years of capture data and plotted it against stream discharge rates and found that as stream discharge increases, the number of non-reproductive females that we captured decreased. So when you have small stream discharge, low rates, you get a skyrocketing of non-reproductive females in the system. And then we split up these non-reproductive females into pregnant versus lactating. Pregnancy didn't seem to be affected by the water availability, but lactating females are. All species are not affected the same as well. These are 6 different bat species that we have in the Front Range of Colorado. And what you see in the gray is in normal years, or a little bit above average in terms of precipitation and lower temperatures, versus black, which is drought years. And you see that in every case you have a drop in reproduction, but in some cases these drops are highly significant. So in some cases, less than 50% of the females are reproducing in drought years. Water holes do other things. They structure bat communities and probably communities of other organisms. This is a water hole. This is with a thermal camera, so there's no light here. And I did a project with Jim Simmons, who's out of Brown University, and we looked at how bats came in to drink, and we were quite astonished by this. But if you look at how bats are coming in to drink here, you will see a flight path right through here that these bats are using. So there's up to 9 different species drinking at this water hole, and they've all decided to use one pathway to get a drink. And this has to do with they aren't using one pathway, and they're coming in from multiple directions. They're going to be running into each other. So this is a form of cooperation that bats are doing. So water holes sort of build in cooperation among different bat species. It's pretty neat. We also found that bats also are competing for water holes. And this is a sequence of how bats come into the water hole, not as individuals, but as species groups. And so Cilia labrum comes in first, and then it's followed by Evotus and Lucifugus, and on down the line. And you can set your clock to it. Okay, you know, it's 10 after 9, the little browns are going to be coming in now. And then what that does is calls for a temporal displacement. This is the timing of these bats coming in and which other species they're different from. Not only that, but bats that overlap the most in visitation times had the most significantly different population numbers at those water holes. Water holes also provide a mineral base for things like calcium. Female bats lose up to 50% of the calcium in their bones during the lactation period. They need to replenish that somehow, and insects do not provide a good calcium source. Bats have been observed in their hibernation sites, which commonly are in limestone caves, licking the water off of the limestone caves, presumably to get calcium. Well, what we showed is that in water holes that had high hardness, driven by dissolved calcium in solution, that there is a relationship between the activity of lactating females and juveniles at these sites. Males tend to go to sites that don't have as much calcium in the water. Bats also segregate the environment, and this is driven by wing form. So bats have different shapes and size wings, which allow for different flight abilities. So you have forest bats, you have open area bats, and you have some bats that's sort of in the gray area in between. We wanted to know how bats, whether water holes structure bat population numbers. And as I showed you, when bats come in to drink, it's a highly organized situation right down at the surface of the water. They come in a certain order, and they all line up the same way. It's like a runway at an airport. Okay? That's very different than what's going on above the water hole. It's more like this, where bats are all flying around up there trying to get in the queue and foraging for insects. And what water holes do is they bring bats that are separated when they're foraging. Like I said, some are in the forest, some are open, some are at the edge. They're segregated, they're not competing. But when it comes to water, it's kind of like a bird feeder effect. It's bringing them all together. So bats that never see each other when they're foraging are suddenly thrown together in high density at these water sources. I'm going to skip this one for a second. We don't really need it. One of the things we found was I plotted the proportion of population sizes of different species from all of our captures. And so these are captures from forest flyways and in the open and at water holes all together. And you can see that little brown bats are the most common in the system, and it cascades down through these species, okay, in terms of their proportions in the area. If you look at, these are 4 water holes in where we have the highest density of activity. And what you see essentially and statistically is that same pattern. Okay? But what is remarkable is that the species that is dominating at any given water source is not the same species. In this case, it's little browns. In this case, it's long-eared myotis is the most dominant. Fringe myotis is the most dominant. Okay? But they cause the same cascading effect of proportions of bats at these sites. And so the idea is that it is what is going on at these water holes when all these bats that don't see each other when they're foraging are brought together. Okay, that structures the population dynamics of all of these species living in the same place. We're also finding that climate change is changing sex ratios. You might not think about why, right? Think, how did that happen in mammals, right? We're endotherms. But it's been being shown a lot in marine mammals that warming oceans are changing sex ratios. And it's not the actual warming itself, it's stress. Stress is built around the fact that the environment is changing. And when the environment changes, food resources and water resources and their availability change. So what we found is we look at our capture success of adults from 1996 to 2012, we're getting an steady increase in the number of males in the system and a steady decrease in the number of females. If you know anything about biology, that's not good. Bats should be in 50-50 sex ratios. And it's mostly affecting the juveniles. So again, the blue is males, and we're seeing more males being born in years when it's hot and dry, and many less females being born in those years. What is interesting about this is at the other end, okay, we kind of see the same pattern. It's that there's more males being reproduced than females. So what might be going on here is that there's sort of an optimal temperature precipitation index that bats are adapted best for. And anything below or above that is a problem. We had a really interesting experiment this summer. This is the last thing I'll talk about. This is one of our field sites where we were studying 2 canyons. And as you know, the September 2013 floods rearranged a lot of landscape. And so I'll just show you one here. This is Plumley Canyon. And this is what it looks like. It's generally a dry canyon in the summer. It flows in the spring, but it dries up. Okay? And so you wouldn't expect maybe a lot of bat activity there if it's a dry canyon. This is what it looked like after the flood. And you could probably count about 20 different areas now where bats can drink and find water in this canyon. Stunningly different. If we look at activity in Plumley Canyon based on sonar call passes, what we see is that generally there have been a decline over 3 years, but look at 2014, huge leap. In Gear Canyon, which usually was where that artificial water hole was, so there's always that one water hole there, we saw a huge increase in the pulse of bat activity in these canyons. The evenness among the species using it also was greatly affected. With Gear Canyon, the one that had the artificial water hole, approaching almost a perfect evenness of bat species in that canyon now, whereas before it was down around 0.6. Okay, so conclusion, bats are highly sensitive to environmental stressors. They are canaries in a global coal mine. What is affecting bats initially is going to affect everything in these ecosystems in one way or another. Bat species declines are happening at an unprecedented rate globally. In North America, again, WNS and wind turbines seem to be the sort of immediate threat. But the climate change factors, we're already seeing changes in bats. This year we've had reports, I've gotten a couple specimens of individual bats that have moved further north into Colorado that weren't here before. So bats are moving to some degree. And the long-term negative effects of climate disruption, it's already happening, and bats are already showing the effects of this. Anyway, we should probably do something about it, and I'll end there. Thank you.